Democrats had warned ahead of this.
From you, the American
people. This country. 2 billion. Disagree. I think that a memorandum of
But either way, it is going to be very interesting to...
Trump stood before the nation in a primetime address and accused China of carrying out what he described as the largest compromise of election data in history, claiming Beijing had illicitly acquired 220 million United States voter files. It was a dramatic charge, delivered with the full weight of the presidency. Yet by Tuesday, July 21st, standing in the Oval Office beside the president of Lebanon, Trump appeared to soften that same accusation, saying the alleged interference took place a long time ago and adding that the United States does similar things too. The question I want to examine is why the tone changed so quickly and what it tells us. Let me take you carefully through what actually happened, because the sequence matters and the details are easy to blur together. The story centers on President Trump, the People's Republic of China, and the 2020 presidential election that Trump lost to Joe Biden. It also touches the intelligence community, the Department of Justice, the coming November midterm elections, and the broader relationship between Washington and Beijing. What began as one of the most forceful allegations any sitting president has leveled against a foreign power ended less than a week later, with the same president declining to promise any consequences. That gap between the accusation and the follow-through is the heart of today's report. The starting point was that primetime speech. In a roughly 25-minute address, Trump told the country that newly declassified documents revealed what he called shocking vulnerabilities in America's election infrastructure. His central claim was specific. He said that starting during the 2020 election cycle, China had carried out the illicit acquisition of 220 million United States voter files. According to his account, that stolen information included names, home addresses, phone numbers, and political party preferences of American voters. Trump called the situation an unprecedented election security nightmare, and he described the alleged Chinese operation as sinister election meddling aimed at the country's democratic process. Trump went further than simply naming China. He accused elements of the United States intelligence community of hiding the scope of what he alleged.
But to me, the contract is, the real question is about, so we do a memorandum of understanding, which frankly, you could do or not do. I don't care if you do it or not. To me, it doesn't mean very much.
He claimed that dozens of significant reports from agencies such as the CIA and the NSA about China's election targeting had been kept out of the presidential briefing while he was in office. He said that members of what he called the deep state had worked to suppress and downplay information about the extent of the alleged meddling, keeping it from both the president and the American people.
Elections, and nor would it ever do so. In the coming hours, we will have a press conference from the Foreign Ministry, the regular Foreign Ministry press briefing, and no doubt questions.
He called his claims irrefutable, and the White House released a collection of newly declassified documents on a dedicated website in conjunction with the speech. There was also an enforcement dimension to the announcement. Trump said he had ordered the Department of Justice to prosecute those he believed were involved. That is a significant step because it moves the matter from rhetoric toward potential legal action, and it raises immediate questions about who exactly would be targeted, on what evidence, and under which statutes. As of now, officials have not detailed specific charges or named specific individuals tied to that instruction, so the practical reach of that order remains unclear. What I can tell you is that the president framed it as a demand for accountability, not merely a warning. Now, here is where the accuracy of the claim becomes central, and I want to handle this carefully rather than simply repeat the assertion. Independent fact-checking organizations that reviewed the speech and the released documents reached conclusions that complicate the president's framing. Reviewers noted that state voter files in the United States are, for the most part, publicly available. This kind of information, including names, addresses, and party registration, can be legally purchased and is routinely used by campaigns and political parties to decide which voters to contact. The existence of that data in foreign hands, several analysts pointed out, does not by itself mean that any state or local voter registration system was breached or that any vote was altered, an election security expert who has held federal roles under multiple administrations, including both Trump administrations as well as the Obama and Biden administrations, made this distinction plainly. He noted that possessing voter registration data does not mean the underlying databases or infrastructure have been broken into, and he emphasized that much of this information can be legally obtained by members of the public. One of the released documents itself, according to reviewers, indicated that voter registration information covering roughly 2013 to 2021 was publicly available for download from commercial websites, and that it appeared to have been downloaded in 2020.
Warned ahead of this speech that Mr. Trump was laying the ground to interfere in November's midterm elections, in which the Republicans risk losing control.
In theory, the document suggested such data could be used to support influence operations, but that is a description of potential, not proof of action. That brings us to the intelligence assessments that Trump's claims appear to contradict. A 2021 assessment from the United States intelligence community, produced after the 2020 vote, concluded that China did not deploy interference efforts and considered but ultimately did not deploy influence efforts intended to change the outcome of the presidential election. That assessment expressed high confidence in its judgment. It also noted that China did not view either outcome, a Trump victory or a Biden victory, as advantageous enough to justify the risk of being caught interfering. In other words, the president's assertion that China ran a decisive operation against him in 2020 goes beyond, and in key respects conflicts with, what the intelligence community previously concluded. There is an important nuance here that I do not want to lose. Fact-checkers acknowledged that Chinese officials had, at various points, analyzed publicly available state voter rolls, and an intelligence assessment from April 2020 reflected that activity. So it is not accurate to say that China had no interest in American voter data. What reviewers disputed was the leap from that interest to the president's sweeping characterization of the largest election data compromise in history, and the further claim that this activity determined or seriously threatened the 2020 result. The distinction between collecting publicly available information and conducting a successful attack on election systems is the crux of the disagreement. Beijing's own response was swift and firm.
A memorandum of understanding is a binding agreement between two people, and that's what we're talking about. It's detailed, it covers everything.
China's foreign ministry, through spokesperson Lin Jian, rejected the allegations as entirely fabricated and said they were aimed at vilifying China. A Chinese official reiterated that Beijing has no interest in interfering in United States elections and stated that it has never done so. Whether one accepts that denial or not, it is an official government position from the accused party, and it belongs in the record alongside the accusation. When a claim comes from one government and is denied by another, the responsible approach is to present both clearly and let the audience weigh them. That sets the stage for the reversal that makes this a fresh story rather than a rerun of last week's speech. On Tuesday, July 21st, President Trump welcomed Lebanese President Joseph Aoun to the White House for a bilateral meeting in the Oval Office. During that appearance, a reporter asked the president directly whether he planned to put any pressure or impose any consequences on China over what he had announced regarding the 2020 election. The answer was notably measured. Trump said the two sides would talk about it, then added that it took place a long time ago. He suggested that China today may be a little different than it was then. Then came the phrase that drew the most attention.
US voter details, but he didn't go into any explanation as to how the possession of those voter details, personal information, phone numbers, what sort of impact.
Trump said, in reference to China, that they do things, and the United States does things to them too. He described it as not a one-way street, and he did not elaborate on what he meant by the United States also doing things to China. He closed by repeating that officials would be talking to Beijing. What he did not do was preview any specific punishment, sanction, or retaliatory measure. 5 days after describing a breach of historic proportions, the president effectively placed the matter in the rearview mirror while promising only future conversations. What stands out to me in this exchange is the contrast in energy and stakes. The primetime address was structured as a national security revelation, complete with declassified files and a directive to prosecute. The Oval Office remarks, by comparison, downgraded the same episode to something old, mutual, and negotiable. That shift is the reason this development is newsworthy. It is not that the president abandoned the claim, he did not retract it. It is that the promised accountability did not translate into any announced action, and the framing moved from outrage to a shrug. To understand why the timing carries weight, we need to look at the political calendar.
I don't like MOUs because they don't mean anything. To me, they don't mean anything. I think you're better off just going into a document. I was never a fan of an MOU.
So an MOU.
The primetime speech came as the president and his allies were pressing for significant changes to how American elections are conducted ahead of the November midterms. Those efforts include redistricting pushes, added procedural steps for voting, and renewed calls to pass legislation. Trump used the same address to urge the Republican-led Congress to pass what is known as the Save America Act, a bill that would require photo identification to vote and proof of citizenship to register, among other provisions. Supporters describe it as a common-sense safeguard. Opponents argue it could make voting harder for eligible citizens, particularly low-income voters and voters of color. Both characterizations are contested, and the bill's fate in Congress is not settled. The broader political environment adds another layer. Polling ahead of the midterms has suggested that Democrats are favored to retake the House of Representatives, and the president's approval numbers have been under pressure. Trump has also spoken about his concerns regarding investigations he could face if Democrats gain control of one or both chambers of Congress. I raise these points not to assign motive because I cannot read anyone's intentions, but because they form the documented backdrop against which this election security message was delivered. The audience deserves to know the context in which such a dramatic charge was made. There is also a foreign policy dimension that helps explain the softer tone on Tuesday. The president is scheduled to host his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping, at the White House in September. That planned summit gives Washington and Beijing a shared interest in keeping tensions manageable in the weeks beforehand. A leader preparing to receive another head of state for high-level talks has practical reasons to avoid escalating a confrontation just before that meeting. It is reasonable to note this as relevant background, though I want to be clear that the administration has not publicly linked the two, and I am not asserting a direct cause. The presence of Lebanese President Joseph Aoun in the room is worth a brief word as well, because it explains the setting rather than the substance. The China question arose during a meeting focused on relations between the United States and Lebanon. Aoun, a former commander of the Lebanese military, took office in early 2025 after a prolonged political deadlock had left Lebanon without a president. His election was widely seen as a boost for the pro-Western camp in the region. The China remarks were not the purpose of that meeting. They surfaced because a reporter raised them while the two leaders appeared before the press. That is a common feature of Oval Office availabilities, where the news of the day often intrudes on the scheduled agenda.
All they kept saying is, this is the most secure election in the history of our country.
So that was President Trump speaking just
Let me widen the lens to the other claims Trump made in that speech, because the China allegation did not stand alone. The president also said a review by the Department of Homeland Security had identified roughly 278,000 non-citizens registered to vote in federal elections. He did not detail the methodology behind that figure, and fact-checkers noted that non-citizens are permitted to vote in some local elections in certain places, which can account for their presence on some rolls. He asserted broadly that the declassified documents revealed fraud and vulnerabilities. Reviewers who examined the released material found many pages heavily redacted, making independent verification difficult, and they cautioned that references to voter registration data did not, on their own, establish that any election outcome had been changed. One of the more striking findings from the released documents cut in a different direction than the president's central message. According to reporting on the Trove, a declassified document from 2020 portrayed Russia, not China, as the country that had tried the most to penetrate American election systems, and it described those efforts as aimed at defeating Joe Biden rather than Trump. That same document reportedly noted Russian efforts to amplify claims about Biden connected to the Ukrainian energy company that had employed his son.
Just remind us how relations are between the two countries with that upcoming trip by Xi Jinping to the US.
This detail complicates a simple narrative because it suggests the underlying intelligence painted a more layered picture of foreign activity than the speech's headline emphasis on China conveyed. There was also a separate disclosure tied to the announcement involving the FBI, whose director is Kash Patel. The interweaving of a national security address, newly declassified files, a prosecution directive, and additional agency disclosures made this a coordinated rollout rather than a single offhand claim. That coordination is part of why the softer follow-up drew such notice. When an administration marshals that much apparatus to make a case, observers naturally expect the case to be pursued. The Tuesday remarks left open the question of whether it will be pursued in any concrete way, or whether the matter will remain primarily a rhetorical one. So who is actually affected by all of this, and how? The most immediate stakes involve public confidence in elections. When a sitting president tells the nation that a foreign adversary compromised hundreds of millions of voter records, that message can shape how citizens view the integrity of their own votes, regardless of how the specific claim holds up under scrutiny. Election officials at the state and local level, who administer the actual systems, may face renewed questions from constituents. Voters themselves are left to navigate competing accounts from the White House, from fact-checking organizations, and from prior intelligence assessments. Sorting through those layers is not easy, which is exactly why careful attributed reporting matters here. The relationship between the United States and China sits at another pressure point.
To have been achieved was a sort of semi-normalization between the superpowers, and the hope that in the future there could be much more,
Trade, technology, and security tensions between the two countries have been persistent, and any accusation of election interference adds strain to an already complicated relationship. Yet, the president's Tuesday framing, describing mutual activity and downplaying the urgency, may be read in Beijing as a signal that Washington does not intend to escalate over this issue right now.
Trump is sort of painting a picture of a fragile voting system whereby he can claim that any victory for the Democrats in November may well be rigged.
Whether that eases or complicates the planned September summit is not something I can predict. It is one of the open threads to watch, and its resolution will depend on choices both governments have yet to make public. There is also the legal dimension created by the prosecution directive. Ordering the Department of Justice to pursue those allegedly involved is a serious instruction, but the path from a presidential statement to an actual case is long and governed by rules of evidence. Prosecutors must identify defendants, establish jurisdiction, and demonstrate that laws were broken. If the underlying conduct amounts to downloading publicly available data, as some of the released documents suggested, building a criminal case becomes considerably more complicated. It is not yet clear whether any charges will follow, and the president's own softer tone on Tuesday raises the question of how vigorously the directive will be pursued. Let me address the question I suspect many of you are asking, which is whether the president backed away from his claim entirely. Based on the available information, the answer is no. He did not retract the accusation that China acquired voter files, and he did not withdraw the declassified documents. What changed was the posture toward consequences. On Thursday, the emphasis was on exposure and accountability. On Tuesday, the emphasis shifted to the passage of time and to a sense that both countries engage in comparable behavior. That is a change in framing and in urgency, not a formal reversal of the allegation itself. The distinction is subtle but important, and I want to be precise about it. Another fair question is whether there is any independent confirmation of the 220 million figure or the characterization of a historic breach. Here the honest answer is that the strongest claim, the assertion that this represented the largest compromise of election data in history with decisive intent, has been challenged rather than corroborated by the outside reviewers who examined the released files. The narrower point, that Chinese actors have collected and analyzed American voter data, much of it publicly accessible, has support in earlier assessments. The gap between those two statements is where the controversy lives, and it is why responsible coverage cannot simply repeat the headline number as settled fact. I also think it is worth separating what is confirmed from what remains unresolved, because this story mixes both. What is confirmed is that the President delivered a primetime address on July 16th making these allegations, that the White House released declassified documents, that he ordered the Justice Department to pursue those involved, that China denied the allegations, and that on July 21st he declined to announce consequences while calling the matter old and mutual. What remains unresolved is whether any prosecution will materialize, whether the declassified documents will withstand independent scrutiny, how Beijing will respond in the run-up to the September summit, and how the episode will factor into the political fight over election rules before the November midterms. The political response inside the United States adds yet another dimension. The speech and its framing drew pushback not only from Democrats but, according to reporting, from some Republicans who questioned the timing and the presentation. That kind of cross-party skepticism is notable because it signals that the debate is not falling neatly along the usual partisan lines. When members of a president's own party raise concerns about how a claim is being made, it often reflects unease about the evidence or about the political risk of overreach. I am not characterizing the motives of any lawmaker here, only noting that the reaction has been more mixed than a straightforward party line split. For everyday Americans, the practical consequences may feel less immediate than the political drama suggests, at least for now. No one has been told their vote was changed, and the systems that count ballots are administered at the state and local level with numerous safeguards. What could touch ordinary citizens more directly is the legislative fight the president tied to this message. If Congress advances new identification and registration requirements, the effect on how and whether people vote could be tangible. That outcome remains uncertain because the legislation has not passed and its provisions continue to be debated. I mention it so you can see how a national security claim connects to concrete questions about voting access. Looking ahead, several developments would clarify the picture. One would be any formal action from the Department of Justice, which would show whether the prosecution directive is being pursued or set aside. Another would be a detailed independent analysis of the declassified documents, which would help establish what the files actually demonstrate. A third would be the tone of the September meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping, which could reveal whether this dispute becomes a lasting point of friction or fades into the background of a broader negotiation.
The final contract is really the thing, Bob, and I think you mean that too, is really the thing that means something. A memorandum of understanding is exactly that. It's a memorandum of what our understanding.
And a fourth would be how Congress handles the election legislation the president championed. Each of these is a genuine open question rather than a foregone conclusion. If the matter moves forward, the next stage could involve either concrete legal filings or a quiet de-escalation, and it is not yet possible to say which is more likely. One possible outcome is that the administration treats the speech primarily as a political and messaging exercise with limited follow-through against China. Another is that investigators pursue specific individuals or entities, which would keep the story alive for months. That would depend on the evidence prosecutors believe they can present, and on the administration's priorities heading into a summit with the Chinese leader. Both paths remain open, and the president's shifting tone across 5 days leaves room for either. Let me bring this back to the central development. In the span of less than a week, President Trump moved from a national address describing a historic Chinese assault on American elections to a far more restrained Oval Office response that promised talks but no punishment. The core allegation stands on the record, contested by fact-checkers and by a prior intelligence assessment, and firmly denied by Beijing. What has not appeared is any announced consequence to match the severity of the original claim. That distance between the words and the follow-through is what makes this worth watching. It sits at the intersection of election politics, foreign policy, and the credibility of official claims, and its resolution will shape how the story is ultimately understood. I want to leave you with a clear sense of where things stand and what to monitor. The confirmed facts are the speech, the documents, the prosecution order, China's denial, and Tuesday's downgraded tone. The unresolved questions are whether any legal action follows, whether the documents hold up under review, how the September summit unfolds, and how the linked election legislation fares in Congress. Those are the threads that will determine whether this becomes a lasting confrontation or a brief flare that quiets before the midterms. I will keep following each of them as new and verified information emerges. Thank you for watching my report on President Trump's allegations of Chinese election meddling and his subsequent decision to hold off on any consequences. This remains a developing situation, and the next official move, whether from the Justice Department, from Beijing, or from Congress, could bring the picture into sharper focus. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can follow the latest verified updates on Trump, China, and the fight over American elections as this story continues to unfold in the days and weeks ahead.